Well, woo, excuse me, brethren. Happy Sabbath, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to this Friday night Sabbath Eve Bible study for, well, let's see, what is it here? The third day of the second month. We are now into the second month on God's holy sacred calendar. On the pagan Roman calendar, it's the 10th day of the month of May 2024 until midnight tonight, according to man. And then, this is man's calendar, and the dates are set up by man. It's a Roman calendar, so yeah, it is May 10 until midnight, and then it becomes May 11. And, the month of May is named after some pagan goddess, some Roman god, the god of May. And man, as we've so often mentioned, does this weird thing of starting days in the middle of the night at midnight when God made the days change at sunset. And you could go out and see a day end as the sun goes down, and a new day begins. And it begins with the evening when you can relax from your day's work and, spend some time with your family, have a meal, have a little time to do maybe some private study and prayer with God, and then get a good night's rest, at least 7, 8 hours sleep. There's a recommendation by many sleep experts for 8 hours. Some people get by with 7. Some get by with less, but they actually are paying a price by doing that. But all right, here we are. And I do want to apologize tonight after setting a little bit of a habit of getting the live streams on time. I got stuck away from my house tonight. I do the live streams from my house. I got stuck away and rushed back as quickly as I could. And we do have a telecast with Mr. Armstrong tonight that relates to what's going on in the Middle East, and it's one entitled A Quest for Peace. And there are some who are making a quest for peace, yet in this world today, man's method of even among our brothers, Judah, man's method for peace is to beat your enemy up. I mean, in this world, if you don't have an army in this world, brethren, even we who are called to the spring harvest should be thankful when we live in a country that has a well trained, a well provided for, a well stocked, well armored military, because basically we can go to bed at night and sleep at peace, believing that our country's going to protect us from enemies, and that our having a military and a lot of armor and brass and all that will cause a lot of potential enemies to say, hey, hold on, we're not going there. We're not going to try to take over that country. They'll beat our pants off. And, so there's some wisdom in having an army. And, if we weren't called to God's church, and if we weren't called to an understanding where God said, stand still and watch me do battle for you, having that faith, you could depend on that. But having man that can't depend on that, he's not called to know God fully now. So he's wise to have an army and to look mean and to have a lot of armor and be willing to use it. Now, when you're not willing to use it, and when you pretend to be an ally with somebody else that has an enemy that wants to take them from the river to the sea, meaning, they complain about genocide, and yet they complain about genocide against themselves when there really is none. Israel doesn't desire to knock out all of the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs, or even a portion of the Arabs in a certain land in the Middle East. And yet they claim that. And it's like the guy with the finger pointing at somebody else. He's got 3 pointing back at himself. their goal is genocide. So that you accuse the other side of what you're trying to do, and then people won't think you're trying to do it. They'll think the other side's trying to do it to you, and if you do it to them, you're justified, see? All kind of crazy reasoning of men. Well, all right, we've got the calendar on the screen, and let's talk about exactly where we are. Thank you, Mr. Joe. We've got it highlighted so you can see with a border around the 10th and the 11th on the Roman calendar. Tonight, on Friday night, it's the 10th day of May. After midnight, as we mentioned earlier, it'll be the 11th day of May. That's on the Roman calendar side. On God's side of the calendar, on the right side, that yellow is highlighted on day number 3 in the second month, the month of Zif, Z-I-F, as the Jewish people call it, and it may even have a Babylonian name that's in the Bible by Ziph. It's the third day it's the second month. Ziph is the second month, and it's the third day of the second month. Now, in this month, we're counting down 7 weeks that must be complete, and when the sun goes down at the end of this Sabbath, we will have completed already 2 weeks of the 7 weeks that we count toward Pentecost. 2 weeks will be complete. There'll just be 5 more weeks to go. And then after that 7th week, after that 7th Sabbath of the 7th week, and they are weeks that begin on the first day of the week, just like the creation of man week, that began with the evening and the morning being the first day and ending with God creating man on the evening and morning of the 6th day, and then God saying, hey, it all looks good. I have worked hard, and I'm going to take a rest for a day. And we're going to actually create a specialness in the 7th day by resting. A day and a time when you remember me, your Creator, and I'm going to come and be with you on that day in a very special way. But there are people that argue against that and say, we'll pick our own day, thank you. When God has said, look, remember the 7th day. Don't remember the day that you call number 7 or that you appoint as a day of worship and that you pick and decide that's when you're going to worship me. You're not worshiping me when you do that. You're not obeying me. And when I say I'm going to come and be with you on that day, I'm there for you that day. If you're picking another day, you're picking a day when I'm not there with you. You're picking a day that's a work day. I expect to see you working that day. But no, you decide you're going to call it a rest day, and you don't really rest, make a full Sabbath of it. Most of you work on the day you appoint as your worship day, that you appoint as your worship day anyway. And if you're an employer or boss, you try to make, if we work for you as an employee, you try to make the rest of us miserable because we refuse to work on the day that God said take a rest, and that you don't take a rest on, and that you occasionally try to force our hand, try to force us to work and threaten us that, hey, we're going to go down. You're going to lose your job if you don't work. Well, I can't work. But thankfully, there are even laws right now we're finding out that are on the books that tell the employers to try to accommodate you, and that if they don't, that law can be used against them. However, anytime you're arguing law, you see what a former president is going through with law being used against a person, and those who are able to decide whether they're going to take you to law on this or that, and those that have the money to hire lawyers to take you to law, sometimes they'll spend the money just for spite, just to spite you. But let's focus where we're going to go with Mr. Armstrong tonight. And if you've done like I've done, I'm working 2 jobs. Beside this ministry, I'm working another job at the moment, a job that, if it works out, will actually be a great asset to this ministry in numerous ways. even though it's taking me an iron fist, strong arm muscle worth of work to get it done during the week, and my sister keeps encouraging me, and she is right. It is getting easier each week. It was hardest the first week. It took me 3 weeks to do 1 week's work when I first started this little project I'm doing. I'm not going to tell you what it is right now, but if I really do succeed at it, I'll tell you later. Some few of you know. And Alan, I appreciate it if you keep that under your hat for just a little while till we see whether it's going to be a go or not. I keep going to God and praying and saying, God, I really want to keep you first in everything, and the ministry you've called me to. I want to keep that first. And I've kind of used that as an excuse to say, I think I'm going to quit this other thing. But it does seem like God inspires my sister to speak up and say, no, don't quit. Keep going. You're almost at the top. And she would remind me of the 7 laws of success. And the booklet by Mr. Armstrong, how he points out that so many people, when they start a new endeavor, they take it 90% of the way, and they do the 60 to 70 to 90%, which is the roughest part. That's the final part of it as you're going uphill, and then you get nearly to the top. When you get to the top, from there you keep going forward, and you go downhill. It gets easier. But that last 10%, like the tip of the mountain, it's the most precarious. It's the hardest. It takes the most energy and effort. The gravity pull on you is greatest at that point, and it's just harder. That last 10% at the top, especially you get down to the last 2%, and that's where most people quit and give up when they're that close to the top, because it's real hard at that point. And if they would just keep up the effort for a little longer and the extra effort it may take to push on up to the top, then you've got a success under your belt, and you can ride it from there for a while. Well, you got to keep working it, but it ain't the same as when you're pushing uphill. When you're going up down the other side, and going down is actually profitable. All right, I'm talking maybe crazy like on the radio, without a graphic on the screen. Brendan, let's go ahead and go to. We've covered the dates. Well, all right, we'll go there in just a moment. I really want to get us to this telecast by Mr. Armstrong on a quest for peace and how much we need that. If you've been watching the news, you've probably seen in the last week and a half the International Court the International Criminal Court for war crimes and things like that has been trying to issue an arrest warrant against Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. And thankfully, the ACLJ out of the United States has been filing papers and petitions and making appearances. They did put out a plea and ask for people to help. I did twice send in a small contribution. Each time they asked for it, they asked, could you at least send a certain minimum? And it was a small amount, a minimum small amount. And I responded positively to that both times. I said, okay, I'll do exactly what you're asking. I'll send this minimum amount you're asking. And, that was affordable. All you got to do is skip a meal or two to send $5 each time. And I was happy to do it and was able to put some heart in my prayer and say, hey, bless their effort to try to keep that arrest warrant being issued against former Prime Minister, against the present Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. And he's had a tough go. He's got people against him on both sides, even some of his own people. Against him. The people that have family members that are hostages, they want those hostages even at a compromising cost. And there are others who, come on, let's go with this all-out, war, destroy Hamas, our enemy, so they can't crank back up and do this again in a short time from now. totally wipe out Hamas. Now, that's not like from the river to the sea where there are certain people that want to wipe out all of the descendants of Isaac. And that doesn't mean just the Jewish people, by the way, folks. Ding, ding, wake up call. And so you got some people that would like to see especially Judah and the people in Israel, the people of the Middle East country called Israel. They'd like to see them totally removed from those lands. And do you realize a big reason for that argument being made against the descendants of Judah in Israel today, in the little nation state of Israel today? Do you realize, brethren and friends, that a lot of that is based on a false religious teaching? Let me just tell you what the religious teaching is, and you can decide for yourself whether it's true or false. I mean, it is totally, absolutely contrary to what God says in the Bible about whom he told Abraham to take up on the mountain to sacrifice. Most of you know God told Abraham in Genesis, as recorded in Genesis, to take his son Isaac up to the mountain and offer him for a sacrifice. And you know, Abraham had with Sarah's handmaid Hagar a son, what was it, about 10 years or more before Isaac was born? He had the son Ishmael with Sarah's handmaid Hagar, which was at the invitation of Sarah to have a son by her handmaid on her knees. But her handmaid reneged on that deal, refused to have little Ishmael born onto the knees of Sarah, which was, in their culture of the day, meant it would be a formal adoption and that the son would be considered Sarah's son legally. But Hagar reneged on it. So Hagar kept the legal motherhood or standing for her son Ishmael and made fun, even after Sarah had Isaac, would make fun of Sarah and Isaac because her boy was older. And of course, an older boy has more abilities than a young lad. and Abraham loved his son Ishmael by Hagar. And so Hagar began to act arrogantly around Sarah, like, I'm as good as you are. I'm even better than you are. I had Abraham's first son. But failing to realize that the word used for wife, by the way, can also just mean another woman. And all indications by every word of God indicates that Hagar was not, N-O-T, put it in all caps, was not a wife of Abraham. She was just a handmaid that was going to have a son on Sarah's knees that would be adopted by Sarah and Abraham, by Abraham and Sarah. And that didn't happen. And so God referred later to the two sons as one as being legitimate and the other as being illegitimate. And when God was preparing to give a certain land to the descendants of Abraham via his legitimate son by Sarah, he told Abraham to take Isaac up to the mountain. And I think many of you know that already, or, should we take a look at that? Let me see. Let me do something here. Isaac, Abraham, mountain. Let's see, that thing cut off. Abraham, mountain. Well, why is this not working? Abraham, mountain. Well, I turned it on at the wrong moment. It copied when I said, why is this not working? I'm trying to use a search on on a web page, instead of using my, let me do this the right way. I'm going to open up a electronic concordance that I have. Let's put that scripture up on the screen while we're talking about this. This is important, and this very much relates to what Mr. Armstrong's going to talk about with a quest for peace in the Middle East. Because listen, that a lot of that upset is based on a teaching in a certain so-called religious book that says Abraham was told by God to take Ishmael, Hagar's son, up to the mountain and sacrifice him. And it says Abraham did that, and that there was a ram in the bush provided by God when God saw that Abraham was going to go ahead and take Ishmael's life, and that as a result of that, Ishmael was promised all that land in the Middle East that was actually, according to God's word in the Holy Bible, promised to Isaac, Abraham's son Isaac, and Isaac's descendants. All right, let me try this now. Let's see. We're going to type in Isaac, and we're going to type in Abraham. Let me see how many scriptures that brings up. 67 verses of scripture. I think maybe the first few I can find it here. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt by the well Lahara. Boy, that gets to that pretty quickly. That's already in Genesis 25. All right, it's Genesis 22. I can see it because it's talking about laid the wood and bound Isaac his son in Genesis 22, verse 9. So let me punch up in the Bible display Genesis 22. If you want to go there with me. That's what I'm going to display on the screen in just a moment. We're going to take a look at some of the verses in God's Word in the Holy Bible. We're going to look at some scriptures where it tells us God told Abraham to take Isaac up to the mountain and sacrifice him. And then we won't turn there in the Quran, but we'll just make the reference as to how the Quran tells its readers the same story, except instead of saying Isaac, it switches it and says God told Abraham to take Ishmael up on the mountain. All right, let's see. I've got this. I've got Genesis 22 starting in verse 1 on the Bible display screen, and I'll put that on the screen here for you. And it came to pass, after certain things that are talked about in the previous chapters, that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham? And Abraham said, Behold, Lord, here I am. And verse 2, where that was verse 1 of Genesis 22. We're in verse 2 now. And God said, Take now your son, your second son, Isaac. Now, if you're paying attention either to your own Bible or on the screen, did you notice that the verse does not say that God said, Take now your son, your second son? No, he said, Take your son, your only son, and he names Ishmael, doesn't he? Oh, no, Stephen, he doesn't name Ishmael here. He says, Take your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and get you into the land of Moriah, and offer him, Isaac, there for a burnt offering. I mean, we're in the same verse where him refers right back to Isaac. Take your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and get you into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I'll tell you of. And so Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took two of his young men with him. He had two witnesses with him. And he took Isaac his son and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place of which God had told him. Now, when Genesis 22 says that Abraham took Isaac and he took along two of his young men. You know, the reference would be men younger than him and younger than Isaac. Remember, Ishmael was older, so Ishmael was Ishmael possibly one of the two young men that Abraham took up along with him, along with Isaac? I would think you should probably say no, Stephen. I think not, because if we read the verses of Scripture in between Genesis 22 and back, we'll see that at this point in time, God had already told Abraham to honor his wife Sarah's request that Abraham send Hagar and her son away from them, because they were causing Hagar and Ishmael were causing Sarah such grief, and God had told Abraham when Abraham went to God about it. He told Abraham to obey what Sarah said. So Abraham goes back and asks Sarah, "What do you want to do?" "Well, I want that woman out of here." And since Abraham obeys God, quite to the T, God had already told Abraham, "You do what Sarah says about this." And so when Sarah said the woman has to go, Abraham went to Hagar and told her and Ishmael, I love Ishmael, my son, but Hagar, you, his mother, and you've been troubling my wife, and she says you need to go, and you need to go. I don't know if he told her all of that, but he did do what God said. God said, you honor what Sarah has to say about this. She has the final word about whether Ishmael and her mother Hagar stay in the camp or not. And Sarah said, nothing doing. She goes. And it wasn't just a one day's trouble. It was a long time of Sarah having been humiliated by Hagar in a way that, women with other women can sometimes be, mean to one another. And it was one-sided. It was one way. And Sarah was the wife of Abraham. Anyway, she had been sent out of the camp. And God tells, I'm pretty sure that's the history. I'm actually scanning the scripture right now to see if I can see where that happened. Let's see. I sure love to find that scripture that where God says to Abraham, you do what Sarah says about this. In Genesis 17, God was saying to Abraham, Sarah, your wife, shall indeed bear you a son. And one of them, either Sarah or Abraham, I think Sarah she just laughed. And it had even asked, look, can a woman that's 90 years old bear a son? And God says, Sarah, your wife, shall indeed bear you a son, and shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and his seed after him. That's Genesis 17, verse 9. I should pop that on the screen quickly here. We'll come back to verse 3. Let me put that in the memory bank. We'll come back to where we are in just a moment. Let's just do a flashback to chapter 17 and verse 9 and just see that for a second. And here's the verse I was just referencing. And God said unto Abraham, you shall keep my covenant, therefore, you and your seed after you in their generations. Let's see. How come that didn't come up the way I was reading that? Let's see. 19. I wanted verse 19 instead of 9. But we can just go through these. In verse 10, this is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you, and your seed after you. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. Brethren, we were taught at Ambassador College that when you recognize that you are of the stock of the tribe, of one of the tribes of Israel, of the descendants of Israel, that it actually is a good thing when parents have a male child circumcised. And even though it's not a requirement spiritually, it was a recognition of your descendancy from being an actual bloodline of Israel. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant between me and you. And that covenant was both spiritual and physical. And verse 12, and he that's 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generations, he that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of your seed. Even adopted kids were to be circumcised too. He that is born in your house, and he that is bought with your money, must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. That probably means that Abraham had Ishmael circumcised. Verse 14, just a small point. And verse 14, the uncircumcised man-child whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And verse 15, God said unto Abraham, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name, Sarah. And verse 16, I will bless her and give you a son also of her. Yea. God says, yes, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. Then, verse 17, Abraham fell upon he fell upon his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that's 100 years old? And shall Sarah that's 90 years old bear? I mean, this was just absolutely side-splitting humorous to Abraham. He thought, how in the world, God, could this happen? I'm 100, she's 90, and she's going to bear a child? And verse 18, Abraham said unto God, oh, that Ishmael, the kid that's already born, might live before you, God. Let's don't do this crazy talk. Just bless me with Ishmael. He's already a live little born kid. And verse 19, God said, Abraham, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son indeed, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And verse 20, as for Ishmael, whom we just saw in the verse, a couple of verses before this, God had said, hey, look, God, just do this with Ishmael. Don't do this funny, weird stuff. Me 100 and Sarah 90. We're going to have a newborn little baby. And God says, Abraham, sober up. You are going to have a son of Sarah. Sarah is going to bear you a son. You're going to call his name Abraham. And as for Ishmael, who you told me to, bless your offspring with Ishmael, I've heard you. I heard you, Abraham. I heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful. and will multiply him, referring to Ishmael now, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes. Sometimes this is referred to as dukes or chiefs, but 12 princes, 12 leaders. He doesn't say kings now, he just says 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. Now, God told Abraham that he was going to make of Sarah a mother of great nations. Each of her 12 sons were representatives of a nation, each son. But Ishmael, he would have 12 princes of one nation. All the Arabs are your descendants of Ishmael. They have 12 princes. They have 12 chiefs. They're divided up into 12 divisions. And yet they're one nation. They're one people. They're all Arabs, all Ishmaelites. Now, some of them call themselves Palestinians, which is not a nation. It's a description of a land that was given to Israel, but it was a negative description to put down Israel because they were captive of an enemy. And that enemy decided to call them Palestinians and call the land Palestine. But that land was not a nation. And that land, when Israel had it, was divided up into 12 little nation states, one to each of the tribes, each of the descendants, the sons of Jacob, Israel, whose name was changed to Israel. Verse 21 now of Genesis 17, but my covenant will I establish with Isaac. Even though I'm going to make Ishmael greatly multiplied and a great nation, and 12 princes shall be under him. But he's going to say later that they're all going to fight among one another. One nation with 12 princes that all are jealous of one another and hate one another, and their hatred for one another is going to make the rest of the world miserable because of them, to some degree. This is what God, we may see that in this chapter, maybe it's another chapter, but my covenant, God said in verse 21, will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah, not Hagar, but Sarah shall bear unto you at this set time in the next year. And verse 22, he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. So God told Abraham how it would be, and then God left. We ain't talking no more, Abraham. You want to laugh about all this? Go have yourself a good laugh, but wait till you see your wife Sarah's belly start to, how do you describe that? How to expand. And verse 23, Abraham, brethren, I hope you're having a wonderful and lovely and happy Sabbath along with me on this Friday night, Sabbath Eve, for Bible study after a hard week that I had. Maybe you had a hard week too. I am so very happy to see this time when we can lay down all our servile work, worship God, and think of God. And we're going to really start thinking about why these 7 weeks we're counting and what they picture. And Jacob, I'm serious. If you're ready to do it, I'm trying to hook up this thing called Zoom. Well, you're already familiar with it, more than I am, I think. I've made arrangements with my live streaming people to hook up the Zoom to my live streaming outfit. And we'll just put you on it for now, and I'm going to ask you if you'll read the scriptures when I read the questions from Lesson 35 of the Ambassador College Correspondence Course. We'll try to plan to start that next Friday night. I kind of was wanting to start it this Friday night, but I was heavy into that job work, and I think I'm finally getting on top of it a little bit. I'm either going to totally quit it this coming week, or I'll get the work done in half a week instead of a whole week. I went from taking 3 weeks to do 1 week's work to then 2.5 weeks to do a week's work, and then 2 weeks, and now I'm down to where I did a week's worth work in a week's time. And it really shouldn't be that much. I think next week I can get a week's work done in half a week, and then we'll focus on doing this Bible study project for the next 5 weeks on the meaning of Pentecost from the lesson 35. If some of you are already into it, terrific. Get a head start. Review it again with us on Friday night Bible studies, and we'll all grow together in a deepened understanding of what is being pictured by these 7 weeks. Why are we counting 7 weeks toward Pentecost? And after the 7th week is complete, that ends with a Sabbath day that is a determining Sabbath. After the 7th Sabbath, we number the very next day, just like we number the day after the weekly Sabbath as the wave sheaf day. We number the day after the 7th Sabbath as day 50, the Pentecost day. Pentecost means 50 count, or count 50. Cost Pentecost. 50 count 50. Let's finish up what I was doing, though, because we do want to get to Mr. Armstrong and a quest for peace. Brethren, would we not like to see peace in the Middle East? And, of course, some of you know it's nice to have some peace in between now and the Great Tribulation. And some of you need yet a little more time. Be thankful to God He's been merciful in giving you this extra time. Those of you that complain, it's been so long since Mr. Armstrong died, Christ hasn't come yet. You better be glad, because those of you with that kind of attitude need that extra time more than anybody else, I might dare say. And Abraham took Ishmael, verse 23, Genesis 17. Wait, now, isn't this what the Quran says? Abraham took Ishmael up to the mountain. Well, let's read further. Hang on. Don't jump to any false conclusions. He's not going to say Abraham took Ishmael up to the mountain. Let's see what he said here. So, he says, and Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house. Guess what happened to them? They, just like God said you got to do with the stranger in your house, or an adopted son in your house that's of another nationality, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the selfsame day as God had said unto him. Abraham don't mess around. God says, do something, Abraham. Boom! Abraham gets up and does it, as we'll see when we get back to chapter 21, 22 in a moment, when God told Abraham to take Isaac up to the mountain. Very next morning, Abraham is up early, saddling that ass and taking his son off. He's not moping and mourning around about it, and he really believes God will still do his promise through Isaac. So he believes even if I sacrifice Isaac, God's going to bring him back to life somehow. You put 2 and 2 together, that's got to be what Abraham, in his diligence, is doing, because Abraham reasoned against God. He even said, my old wife can't have a kid. He learned later, like God said, next year at this time, Bubba, she will. And then Abraham saw it happen. He said, God says he's going to do something. God does it. Let's go on. Verse 24, and Abraham was 90 years old and 9 when Abraham, was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Don't say an old man can't be circumcised. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old. So it wasn't cruel to Ishmael at 13 to circumcise him. Abraham himself was 99 when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. In the selfsame day, verse 26, Genesis 17, was Abraham circumcised and Ishmael his son. And so they did have a certain bond between them. Abraham loved Ishmael, and Ishmael loved his dad, Abraham. And all the men of his house, born in the house and bought with money of the stranger, of Abraham we're talking about here now. They were all circumcised with Abraham. And verse 1 of Genesis 18, the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And I think this is when he's going to tell him that, hang on, I'm going to look ahead just a little bit. He's going to remind him what's going to be coming in the future with his wife, Sarah, is going to bear a child. Verse 6, and Abraham hastened unto his tent unto Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes from the hearth. And Abraham ran unto the herd and fetched a calf, tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. And he took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. And they said unto him, where is Sarah your wife? And Abraham said, oh, she's in the tent over there. Behold, she's in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto you according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah your wife shall have a son. Now Sarah's going to have her big laugh. Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old. They were old, verse 11, Genesis 18. And well stricken in age. And it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. She could no longer normally bear children. She didn't have her periods every month and all that. She'd gone through menopause. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I'm waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also? And verse 13, the eternal Lord God said unto Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of a surety bear a child when I'm old? And verse 14, God goes on to say, is anything too hard for the eternal Lord God? At the time appointed, I will return unto her according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah, verse 15, denied, saying, I didn't laugh, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. Nay, but thou didst laugh. And verse 16, the men rose up from thence and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring him out of the way. Well, we're going to a different story now. Let's push back on further up to where we were. Let's push back to where we were in Genesis 22. And read the next 5 or 6 verses, and then we got to get over to Mr. Armstrong for a quest for peace. And we want to end tonight's Bible study with some thoughts about a coming future peace. Verse 3, Genesis 22. And Abraham, now after God tells Abraham, take your son up to the mountain, take him into the, let's go back to verse 2 for a second. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and get you into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I'll tell you of when you get over there. And Abraham rose up early in the morning. Man, very next morning, boom, he's up and off to do this, and saddled his ass, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering. You know, there was something I wanted to see. Will you bear with me a moment? I'm going to scan through some verses from where we left off. And just hold on. I'm just looking for something. I'm going through it fast just to see if I can see between where we were reading and where we are now in chapter 21 or 22 and chapter 22. I just want to see if a certain event is recorded here or not. Um, all right, we read through these verses I just went through. All right, in chapter 18, I just want to see what's happening here. Hang on, bear with me for a moment. I've got them on the screen for you. Um, okay, let's see. Actually, well, we went a little ways actually here. Yeah, we covered all these verses. Now, because here's where Sarah denied laughing. God says, yeah, hang on, you are going to have a child. So between 19, 20, and 21, let me just see something here. All right, in the intervening verses, we have Sodom and Gomorrah. We have Sodom acting up, and we have the situation of Sodom and Gomorrah come up there with Abraham's nephew Lot. And we have that story about Lot saying, hey, what if we only find so many, God? Instead of 50, we only find 45 or 40 or 30 or 20. And what did he finally get it down to? 10 or something like that? He couldn't even find one other. All right. He offers his two daughters to that crazy mob of people out there that wanted to commit evil with the two angels. They thought they were just two men. All right, that's chapter 19 of Genesis. Okay. Hang on just a little more. I'll get us back up to 22 in a moment. I just want to see if there's a certain event mentioned. All right, all of this chapter 19 is pretty much about Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah and all that, and then Lot's two daughters. Okay, and then we get to where, let's see, restore the man his wife. What happened there in chapter 20? Abraham had gone to another country for a little while. Because here's the story about Abimelech. In chapter 20, that only leaves chapter 21. Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. We're in verse 2 of Genesis 21. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him. He called that son Isaac, not Ishmael. Ishmael had already been born 10 years or more before. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when Isaac was just 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Whoops, that verse didn't advance. Here it is. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. And verse 6, Genesis 21, Sarah said, God had made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, verse 7 of Genesis 21, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children, she should bear children and give children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. And the son grew. The son grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw, I wonder if that has anything to do with what the Jewish people do. They call it, well, some of you can think of that term the Jewish people do when a son gets a certain age. Excuse me, just one second, brethren. Okay, let's go on. I got to push forward. Verse 9, Genesis 21. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. So when Abraham is making a great feast and honoring his son Isaac, a little jealousy pursues here, and so Ishmael is mocking Isaac. That young whippersnapper, I'm the dude here. I'm the firstborn son. But later God's going to refer to Ishmael as an illegitimate son, even in spite of giving him certain honor and saying, I'm going to make a great nation of you. God had a purpose in mind, and we can see that purpose being worked out even right now. People somehow don't seem to take this all the way back to the core issue, the fact that the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael, and that they read this religious book that they have, that the Catholic Church helped produce back in 600 A.D. approximately. I mean, look, there's plenty of evidence. Don't tell me fact checkers say no, this is not true. You're not checking your facts very well if you're not able to get into the basement of the Vatican where they keep all these books, where a Jesuit down there that worked down there revealed, hey, these books down here say we largely wrote that beginning pages of the Quran. And so the Catholic Church put in there that Abraham was told by God to take Ishmael up to the mountain. All right, there's a lot of evidence on that. If we have to come down to push to shove on it, we'll hold to the core. You check the Vatican library, you'll see. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar mocking Abraham, honoring Ishmael. Wherefore Sarah, said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And verse 11, Genesis 21, the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. And verse 12, God said unto Abraham, don't let it be grievous in your sight. Let it not be grievous in your sight because of the lad and because of the bondwoman and all that Sarah has said unto you. Hearken unto her, Sarah. Hearken unto Sarah's voice, for in Isaac shall your seed be called. Brethren, be sure you get this. Verse 12 of Genesis 21. If you need to remember the verse and chapter, look, it's Genesis 2:1 and then reverse it 1:2. 2:1, 1:2. Genesis 21, verse 12. God said to Abraham, in all that Sarah says unto you, hearken unto your wife, your wife Sarah, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac, Isaac, in Isaac shall your seed be called. And verse 13, Genesis 21, also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, not many nations, but a nation, because, Abraham, he is your seed. He's not of Sarah, but he is of you, Abraham, and that bondwoman, God calls her. God doesn't call her a wife, and she was not a wife. Those of you that point to a certain scripture, you got to go back to the original Hebrew, and you'll see that word. Even though it can be rendered wife, it also can be rendered an adulterous woman. Pardon me for laughing, but I mean, there's some humor, when people try to say, look, she was his wife. Well, you got to do more study. You got to discern God's word with depth. Go to the Hebrew English lexicons and look up all the meaning of the word. And then look up the other things God says. God calls that woman a bondwoman, not a wife. And verse 14, Genesis 21, Abraham rose up, God had to tell Abraham and Sarah, look, I told you already you're going to have a child of Sarah. And y'all don't believe, you think you're too old for it. So you think you're going to work out what I told you I'm going to do through both of you. You go get this bondwoman and Sarah's idea and have a child with her. And then later Sarah gets all mad at Abraham and blames him for it. And Abraham's saying, it was your idea, Sarah. You told me to do it. You know, brethren, there's a good lesson in the Bible. Men, women, you're not the head. You can make suggestions, and your husband out of a lot of love can take your suggestion and say, okay, we're going to do that. And if it works out, great, I'll celebrate with you. If it doesn't, I get to blame you because it was your idea. But you're going to blame me saying it was my idea when you brought it up and suggested it. So men, you got to be wise. You got to be wise. You got to be wise. Verse 14. And Abraham, and there's more I could say, but I'm not. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water. Look, God made woman beautiful. Don't get me wrong. And what an asset to man she is, and vice versa. It takes two to really have a good union. Now, there are some people who wind up being eunuchs for God's sake, whether they wanted to or not. They find out in many cases they have to because they have a mission God gave them that some who would like to come along would interrupt that mission and would want compromise to it. And when you recognize that, even against your own desires, you've got to say, I'm staying with this. Abraham actually created a big part of the problem we have in the world today over in the Middle East by yielding to Sarah on going into Hagar. But God said, you know what? That will work for my purpose. I'll be able all the more to have mankind write the lesson of the history of man, that when man doesn't do things my way, God's way, it ain't going to work out. Even though I'm very loving and merciful and forgiving and will love even your enemies to a degree. But I'll take care of your enemies if they misbehave a bit too much. I mean, look, Ishmael and Hagar had to leave the camp of Sarah and Abraham. They had to leave the presence. They were put out. You could say they were disfellowshipped. But God still loved them and hoped to see repentance in them, but they're reserved to the fall harvest, not the spring harvest. Even most of Abraham's descendants are reserved for the fall harvest, a great, colossal, huge harvest. Only a select few are called to the spring harvest. That, brethren, some of you are very blessed to be called to. But let's hurry. We got to see about peace in the Middle East and then finish up this Bible study for tonight. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread. See, he got up early and he headed off to the land of Moriah, and took the child and sent. Let's see. Hang on a second. What's happening here? And Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it to Hagar. Now, this is where he's been told to put Hagar out of the camp. And putting it on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Most of you know the rest of the story, but here they go. Hagar and Ishmael, they now reside in that land over there in the Middle East by huge numbers with 12 princes of the Arab world. And they have a people that are confused, who call themselves Palestinians. They're Arabs, and their Arabs' brothers won't take them in to the land of the 12 princes, any of them. They say, no, take the money the UN will give you and the rest of the nations. We don't want you. We don't even get along with the other 12 princes. 12 princes don't get along with one another. And we're certainly not going to take you confused people in that think you are entitled to receive handouts for the rest of your life. You who came over and tried to take the land that I promised to the descendants of Isaac, and then you holler when they try to take it back, after you had generals of who's their big guy in the Quran, the guy that lived in the 7th century in the 600 AD. I can't think of his name now at the moment. We'll come back to that story. We got to get on to the quest in the Middle East. we're going to leave off right here at verse chapter 21. You can read more, brethren, if you're teased and interested in this later. You got the idea that, hey, Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael off. He promised that Ishmael's descendants would become a great nation with 12 princes. And that's what you got over there, all these chiefs and sheiks, as they call them, who are part of your 12 princes of the descendants of Ishmael and that great nation of Arabs today. And somewhere one of these verses says they'll fight one another among themselves, as well as cause the rest of the world a big headache. A big headache that will cause a lot of expense and a lot of trouble. All right, brethren, I'm going to come back over to the screen and switch us back to where we're going to go now, to Mr. Armstrong, God's end-time apostle, Herbert Armstrong. We're going to pick up in the middle of a telecast he gave on a quest for peace in the Middle East. Let's give him careful ear. I'll be back to say so long at the end of this. Thanks for joining us for the Bible study tonight. Here now we'll pick up with a quest for peace in the Middle East.
The Middle East, a land of centuries-old conflict, but also the land in which President Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin of Israel have recently together lit the torch of peace. Will the rest of the Mideast see the light as well? Or will the flame be summarily snuffed out and this area become the very land that finally plunges mankind into World War III? Importance as the home of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, has today attained even more crucial significance with the current world energy crisis. One man who has become well acquainted with the problems in this part of the world is Herbert W. Armstrong. His first-hand knowledge of this area has kept him ahead of events there for over 30 years. A familiar face in the Mideast, he's had personal meetings with President Suleiman Frangi of Lebanon, Prime Minister Hedi Nouira of Tunisia, King Hussein of Jordan, Prime Ministers Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, and Menachem Begin of Israel, and President Anwar el-Sadat of Egypt. With all, Mr. Armstrong discusses the cause of war and the only sure way to peace. In order to better comprehend the current situation, we need to understand the events that have created the centuries-old Jew-Arab conflict and current OPEC problems. Why has there been such long-standing animosity between Arabs and Jews? Believe it or not, the whole thing started in a family squabble about 4,000 years ago. A common ancestry for both the Arab and Jewish peoples? Yes, surprisingly, both trace their roots to one father, Abraham of the Bible, but to different mothers. Abraham's wife Sarah, being childless, offered her handmaid Hagar to provide him an heir. Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, the progenitor of the Arab peoples. However, Sarah finally did have a son, Isaac, and the Jewish people looked to him as their father. Herein lies the beginning of the centuries-old struggle between Arabs and Jews, two half-brothers fighting over an inheritance. After the Exodus from Egypt, the people of Israel of Old Testament times, as descendants of Isaac, inherited and possessed the Promised Land. Under the successive reigns of David and Solomon, the area flourished in the hands of Isaac's descendants. But after the death of Solomon, Israel split into the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah, respectively. Both were eventually conquered and taken away into captivity. Succeeding world-ruling empires, Babylonian, Persian, Greco-Macedonian, and Roman, each in its turn conquered the area. Under the Persian reign, a contingency of Jews returned to Jerusalem to once again possess the Promised Land. It was the Roman Emperor Hadrian who was to hang the label Palestine on the area now occupied by modern-day Israel. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple, and once again the Jews were expelled from Palestine. The Arabs conquered the area in 640 AD. Passing it down as an inheritance from generation to generation, the descendants of Ishmael, the other half-brother, possessed the Promised Land. But then Zionism, the ideology that the Jewish people should have their homeland in Palestine, arose as a strong force in the early 20th century. With Jewish immigration from Europe beginning around 1870, Zionism played a major role in the development and formation of what is now the nation of Israel. Upon acquiring Palestine and Transjordan as mandates in 1920, the British designated Palestine for the establishment of a Jewish state. Then, in 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted to abolish the 1920 British mandate and partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Despite Arab rejection of the plan, on May 14, 1948, the British withdrew their forces, and the new state of Israel was then proclaimed. With this background, we can understand why the very next day, troops from 7 Arab states invaded Palestine in an effort to reclaim what had been their homeland for almost 2,000 years. The ensuing war between Arab League nations and the fledgling state of Israel lasts for over a year and a half. Finally, on January 7, 1949, the Jewish War of Independence ends by UN mediation. The war increases Israel's holdings by almost half. Most of the territory designated for a new Arab state is annexed by Egypt and Jordan, and over 500,000 displaced Arabs are confined to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But the tension remains, and with the continual animosity exists the ever-present threat that war will break out again. And it does. On July 26, 1956, under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal. An agreement with the Soviet Union has already provided Egypt with large quantities of arms. On October 26th, operating under a secret agreement with both England and France, Israel seizes the Sinai Peninsula, and Franco-British troops take over the Suez Canal, ostensibly to protect it. Pressured by the United States and the Soviet Union, Britain and France withdraw, but it is almost a year later before Israel pulls out. Following the Israeli withdrawal, a UN peacekeeping force is installed to guard the Egypt-Israeli border. But this is yet another short-lived peace. In 1967, Egypt persuades the UN to withdraw its force from the Sinai, after which it immediately blockades the Gulf of Aqaba, shutting off a key Israeli shipping route. Then Egypt deploys troops on the Israeli border. But this time, Israel strikes first. In what came to be known as the Six-Day War, Israel seizes the Sinai Peninsula, Syria's Golan Heights, and all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The victory is swift and decisive, and although the UN Security Council asks Israel to withdraw its troops from the occupied territory, Israel refuses. Yom Kippur, a Jewish holy day, a day of fasting, a day of prayer. And suddenly, a day of war. On October 6, 1973, Egypt, in conjunction with Syria, invades Israeli-held territories. Egypt crosses the Suez Canal and pours into the Sinai Peninsula, while Syria attacks the Golan Heights. But initial success by Egypt and Syria is met by an overwhelming retaliation by Israel. The counterattack carries Israeli troops to within 20 miles of Damascus and over the Suez Canal, deep inside the Egyptian border. A ceasefire is finally negotiated on November the 11th by U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. This war, the fourth since the establishment of Israel as a nation, was again one of heavy casualties on both sides, both militarily and economically. Only this time, the economic repercussions reached out to the rest of the world. Within the Arab League, the OPEC nations retaliated and announced a temporary oil embargo for nations supporting Israel. For the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, oil prices soared upward to unprecedented new highs as shortages appeared. In the last 30 years, we've seen a quickening tempo of animosity in this part of the world. This acceleration of aggression is even more disturbing when viewed in light of man's new means of mass destruction. Today, with the current nuclear proliferation, only the ostrich-like would say mankind's survival is not threatened. Does Israel have the bomb? What about the PLO? While many speculate that Israel already has nuclear weapons, most agree that supporters of the PLO would willingly provide the financial and technological support for them to attain nuclear capability. Such possibilities become even more frightening in this environment of ever-escalating tensions. The world may well have viewed with alarm the election in May of 1977 of former Israeli guerrilla leader Menachem Begin to the post of prime minister. A devout Orthodox Jew, he displays a clear sense of his nation's purpose and identity. But those immediate fears proved to be unfounded, as 1977 provided a ray of hope for peace. For it is to this government that Egyptian President Anwar Sadat not only makes an unprecedented peace overture, but also is the first Arab head of state to visit modern-day Israel. On that historical moment, recorded by newsmen around the world, Sadat risks not only his political future, but quite possibly his very life. The rest of the Arab world is thrown into uncontrollable frenzy as reaction to this unheard-of move ranges from mutual silence to labeling the visit as treason.
And brother, and friends, I just want to point out right here at this point in the video, the timing of this telecast, this video, was June 1981, just roughly 3 months before President Anwar el-Sadat was assassinated. So at the time of this telecast that you're watching now, as announcer Art Gilmore was saying, you know, there was some concern, some thought that President Sadat could be risking his life. Little did the work that produced this telecast, our church, know that that would in fact happen just 3 months after this telecast was set for airing. Let's go back to the telecast now.
After this initial move, Egypt and Israel commence follow-up talks in mid-December. This culminates in Menachem Begin's visit to Egypt, another historic but equally risky venture. Witnessing the Sadat-Begin approach on the pathway to peace, Herbert W. Armstrong recognized the importance of their efforts. No stranger to the Mideast, Mr. Armstrong has, through Ambassador College and the Ambassador International Cultural Foundation, supported numerous programs in the area, such as archaeological excavations, children's playgrounds, and cultural exchange programs between Arab and Israeli youth. Called a builder of bridges between nations, Herbert W. Armstrong continues his efforts for world peace. Listen to Dr. Mohammed Hatem, close personal advisor of President Sadat.
It is a pleasure to me, personally, to receive you, Mr. Armstrong, here, because I know you from a long time, and I know what you are doing for the humanity in all the world. Ambassador Foundation is promoting better understanding between all peoples in all the world. They had about 26 projects in 26 countries in the world.
In recognition of Mr. Armstrong's heartfelt efforts at promoting human understanding, Jerusalem Mayor Teddy Kollek hosted a banquet in his honor.
The ambassadors of Ambassador, the people who are here, are fulfilling a tremendous role for peace in the world. They're here today, they are going to South Africa and to Russia and to China and to many of the countries of Europe, all in the mission of more human understanding. And I want to thank you for your good relationship to us, for your friendship for us, for your efforts that you are making here.
It is in this spirit that Mr. Armstrong begins his current Middle East tour in the changing land of modern-day Egypt. Cairo, a city in a land of contrasts, steeped in tradition, yet longing for progress, tied to the past, but looking to the future. It is ironic that Egypt, the land of the pyramids, physical symbols of permanence, is a land faced with an indefinite future due to the ever-present possibility that war could break out with its Israeli neighbors. Aware of the uneasiness here, of the pervading tension, Herbert W. Armstrong, speaking to some 300 government officials and educators at the Nile Hilton, acknowledged the dangers facing humanity.
I'm not going to speak to you very long tonight, but I'm going to speak plainly, because the time has come for very plain speaking, and I've come a long way to bring you this message. And today we stand, if you pardon my giving you the bad news first, we stand on the very brink of human extinction. Conditions in the world are constantly growing worse, and the weapons now exist of mass destruction that can annihilate all human life from this planet. Now, in all human history, they have never invented a new weapon of mass destruction that has not been used. There is a cause for every effect, and we're in a very bad effect today. And in this world, we've been accustomed to treating with effects and ignoring the causes. And you can never get rid of an effect until you cure the cause. And it's time we learn why. What brought us to this kind of position in the world? Knowledge doubled in the decade of the 60s, but also world's troubles doubled. Troubles that man has been unable to solve or to cure. In the 70s, knowledge doubled again. But again, our troubles doubled. Now, the increased knowledge didn't cause the increased trouble. But on the other hand, the increased knowledge did not solve our troubles. And we still have our troubles. Such things as peace, which we don't have. We work for peace, we fight for peace. Yes, and there are wars constantly going on. There's one in the Middle East right now. But peace and happiness, contentment and joy, and abundant well-being that is universal for all of us, those are spiritual qualities. They're not physical qualities, they're spiritual. And we don't seem to realize that. There is a basic spiritual law, and it is in motion. That law could be stated as the principle of outgoing love toward others. I simplify it by calling it the way of give. Now that is the way of cooperation instead of competition. It is the way of helping, of serving. I simplify it by calling that the way of give, because people can understand that word so well. But the opposite, the transgression of that way, is the way of get. And that's the way this world is living. This world is living the way of get. I love me, and I don't care about you except what I can get from you or take away from you. So the get way is the way of vanity, trying to exalt ourselves, the way of coveting, of lust and greed, the way of envy and jealousy toward others, the way of competition and strife that leads to violence and war.
Having delivered the message of the root cause of humanity's problems to an audience of leading Egyptians, Mr. Armstrong then departed for Israel to continue his Middle East trip. When the Gulf Stream II touched down, this flight became the first since the Six-Day War to go directly from Cairo to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the home of virtually all holy sites of the three major faiths, the Muslim Dome of the Rock, the Jewish Western Wall, commonly known as the Wailing Wall, and the Christian Church of the Holy Sepulchre, are all located within Jerusalem's walls. The city was divided prior to the Six-Day War, and Arab passions were inflamed when Israel took control. Since then, there has been Arab talk of a holy war to regain possession of that part of Jerusalem known as the Old City. Therefore, the present peace is an unstable one. Into this center of age-old animosity, Herbert W. Armstrong brought a message of peace. Speaking to a banquet at the King David Hotel that overlooks the west wall of the Old City, Mr. Armstrong again contrasted the two philosophies of life. Mr. Armstrong concluded his Jerusalem visit with a private meeting with Prime Minister Menachem Begin. During their discussion, Prime Minister Begin gave Mr. Armstrong a personal message to carry to President Sadat of Egypt, with whom Mr. Armstrong was to meet 8 days later. The meeting began with a rather frank appraisal of President Sadat's unprecedented approach to peace.
Mr. President, I want to say one thing right straight from the heart. I respect and admire you more than I can tell you. Because you have risked everything in an effort for peace. And your heart has to be in it, and it has to be genuine. And not many will do that. I meet heads of state all over the world, but I have not known one that would risk what you did of acquiring the enmity of the Arab world in order to have peace. Now that takes courage. And you have it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
President Sadat's spirit of self-sacrifice, already demonstrated in the peace initiative, is clearly reflected in his response to Mr. Armstrong's message.
There are two philosophies of life. There are only two ways of life. Everything in general will fall into one or the other category, and they go in opposite directions. And the one I term in simple language give, the other is get. Now give merely means outflowing love toward others. But I put in just simple language of give and get. The world is geared to get. Everything is get. It's in business, it's in athletics,
Right.
and
Right.
it's in politics,
Right.
and it's in society.
That's right.
And it's just in every segment of life.
That's right.
So I learned this philosophy of give and get. And I tell you what it is, just my way of stating the law of God. And I think the personage I mean by God is the same personage you mean by Allah. Isn't that correct?
Exactly.
and that is his law. And you could express it in the more religious language of love, which is outflowing. But I just take it in the more secular word of give and get. And I think that makes it plain to people in all walks of life, whether they are of whatever religion or of no religion. And it expresses the principle of a way of life. It's just a general attitude of mind,
That's right.
an attitude we have toward one another and toward other people.
And brethren, we're going to pause right there until in the morning. We went a little overtime tonight. For those that watch from the United Kingdom on Sabbath morning as your morning service, well, you'll have almost a 2-hour service. But in the morning in the United States, which will be afternoon in the United Kingdom and in Israel, for our morning service from the United States, I'm going to go over some news. I'll read you some headlines tonight real quickly that are of some concern with what's happening in Gaza and in Rafah. Officials are telling the Times of Israel, who issued a report just a little while ago here on Friday night on the, let's take a look quickly at the calendar. Let's see, can I get this calendar up on the screen, please? Okay, tonight, Friday night, May 10, just a little while ago, to the Times of Israel, officials are telling the Times of Israel that Sinwar is not hiding in Rafah. You know, Sinwar is one of the current big, still living Hamas leaders, and officials say that intel placed the Hamas leader in underground tunnels around Khan Yunis. Emirati Foreign Minister rails at Netanyahu for suggesting that the United Arab Emirates might help to manage Gaza after the war. We'll take a look at those stories in the morning. There's a story from 2 hours ago about how the first since 2003, the United States, a certain weather agency is saying that the Earth is being hit by extreme solar storm. We'll look at that in the morning. Fuming over report, Democratic senator warns it may fuel calls to further limit weapons to Israel. That is a potential big problem with Hezbollah. About to already starting attacks that for which Israel is reported to need continual replenishment of weapons in order to handle the big threat of Hezbollah. They have what they need to handle Rafah, but there's an upset that one of the leaders of Hamas they were hoping to capture has already been hidden in underground tunnels around Khan Yunis and is not he's not hiding in Rafah. And, you know, it's too bad that there are those who claim to be allies of Israel that have actually worked to hamper and interfere with Israel's objectives. I mean, just looking at it from a logistical side of how things work on the human sphere, some things have to be done quickly, and if you hamper it, you allow the enemy a chance to regroup, where if you could have gone in and just taken him out. And unfortunately, there are some who pretend to be allies of Israel who have hampered the success of what normally would be, boom, a success if you keep at it and do it. But no, there have been efforts to slow that down and to interfere. There were 4 soldiers recently killed. 4 Israeli IDF soldiers were recently killed in the current effort. As battles rage across Gaza, tanks said to advance into Rafah, 4 IDF soldiers killed in some of those battles. Security Cabinet said to approve measured expansion of operation in southern part of Strip, and saying that risked a clash with Biden. Dozens of gunmen killed in fighting. Tunnels have been found, more tunnels, and they've been able to use those many tunnels to escort Sinwar out of Rafah and protect one of their top leaders. 150,000 quote-unquote Palestinians have left East. Palestinians is what originally the people of Israel were called by their enemies, to be an insult, because the enemies knew that land was land claimed by Israel as having been given to them by God. But because the enemy was able to come in, God allowed the enemy to come in and put Israel into bondage. The enemy decided to call the Israelite people Palestinians. After the name Palestine, they'd call them Palestinians to put them down. In other words, we're not honoring this land as land given to you by God. We're going to call you Palestinians. And that was called what the Israelites were called. Now the news people want to pick up and promote the idea that the Arab people who lived in that area are called Palestinians, and not including people of Israel who live there. So the news story reports it like this: 150,000 Palestinians have left East Rafah, and a raid in Rafah uncovers 10 tunnel shafts. 10, that's a lot. An unusual story. We'll take a look at this in the morning. 12 soldiers stung by wasp swarm after tank runs over nest in southern Gaza. All right, there's a lot of interesting news stories. There's some that are relating to what the EU is currently doing. EU foreign policy chief: when Spain and Ireland recognize Palestine, others will join. Here's another news story by Reuters. Ireland, Spain could recognize quote-unquote Palestinian statehood later this month. Smotrich warns establishment of Palestinian state is a looming, tangible danger. And there's a contest going over there where an Israeli gal has been having good success, and yet, even in spite of a lot of hatred toward her, she's been able to go on. And let me see if I have that story. I'll have to look for that for in the morning. Boy, a lot of interesting news related to the Middle East. Brethren, we are to pray for the peace of Israel, and there's a lot to watch over there. Mr. Netanyahu has said, referring to Rafah, we have enough arms for Rafah. We'll fight with our fingernails if needed, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said. The Eurovision, that is the thing that a Dutch singer pulled from rehearsal. Israel's Eurovision success sparks boycott calls. And that's because of Israel being successful in Eurovision. So there's been a boycott call. Nonetheless, Dutch singer, and a Dutch singer has been pulled from a rehearsal. Far left party in Spain's ruling coalition. Well, tell you what, we'll pick up with these news stories in the morning. We're going to sign off for now, and brethren, thanks for joining me for this Friday night Sabbath Eve Bible study. On this, let me put the calendar back up. On this third day of the second month on God's calendar, tonight until midnight, the 10th day of May. In the morning, it'll be the 11th day of May. All still one day, the Sabbath. And we'll pick back up with our live stream for the morning Sabbath service beginning at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 2:30 in the United Kingdom, and that's 4:30 in the Middle East. There's 3:30 in parts of Greenwich Mean Time, I think 3:30 tomorrow, but we'll pick back up 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Check the Eastern Time. 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time is when we'll plan to begin the service for the Sabbath here on Sabbath.tv, cogtv.org. And until then, brethren, I wish all of you a very good night, and you're invited to rejoin us again in the morning. Until then, happy Sabbath, Shabbat Shalom.